Hi everybody. This month we're going to be talking about what to do when things go wrong. I can guarantee that you will encounter some issues this year. Hopefully not many, but there will be some. And there will be more the next year and the year after that. There will always be something, no matter how much experience you have. So try not to take it personally because they really can't be avoided. They're not a failure. Some years will be bad for tomatoes, others will be bad for cucumbers. Just don't give up, make notes, and try again. So first, we'll talk about large animals in the garden, which ones are pests, which ones are helpful, and then we'll do the same for insects. After that, we'll cover diseases and then other common problems you may encounter like pollination and nutrition issues. This is by no means a comprehensive list, but it should be giving you a good idea of what you should be looking for. So here are first some animals that you might find in your garden. All right, let's start with rabbits. The telltale sign of rabbit damage is an angled bite taken out of your plant, like they just snipped off the stem at a 45-degree angle. If a rabbit makes it through your fence, be on the lookout for any small holes that they could have gotten in through because they can make it through a hole only like 3 inches or so wide. Your gate is the most likely place for them to get through, so make sure it's secured well and they can't push under it or sneak in the edge. If they're really determined, they can chew through wire, but they probably won't bother. There are all kinds of ways that you can try to deter rabbits by putting coyote urine around your garden and things like that, but most of them are pretty unpleasant. Your best bet for keeping rabbits uninterested in your garden is to control their food sources outside of the garden. And there are 2 strategies for that. If you know that you have an unlimited supply of rabbits, you'll never get them to go away. You might want to make sure that there's plenty of clover and dandelions and violets in your yard so that they have enough food without getting into your garden. Just let the grass grow taller, let them munch on the flowers. Or if you think you have like an isolated family that's more of a rare occurrence, you might instead want to focus on keeping their food sources to a minimum and driving them away. All right, deer. Deer are obviously a major nuisance in vegetable gardens. If you have torn leaves or chewed stems that are higher than a rabbit or a groundhog could reach, you can be pretty sure you have deer. Sometimes they don't do too much damage, but they do have the potential to mow down the entire garden, particularly if you end up with a whole group of deer. Other than missing foliage, the other main signs of deer are their hoof prints and their droppings. In soft soil, the footprints might just sort of look like holes, but you should be able to see their path. And their droppings look pretty similar to rabbit poop, but just a little larger. To keep deer away, there are a million different methods that people use with varying levels of effectiveness. Noisy deterrents like pie plates can work, or bright lights, or motion-activated sprinklers and other scare tactics. But after a while, the deer will probably realize that they're not a real threat. Smell-based repellents like predator urine, cayenne pepper, and commercial sprays are also effective, but you'll need to apply them after every rain or at least weekly. Pretty much every method you hear people recommend has some truth to it, so you can go ahead and try whichever strategies you like, but the only really surefire way to keep them out is through physical barriers. We are using fishing line as a starting point, but that doesn't always do the trick. Electric fencing is very effective, but it's risky if you have pets or young kids. You can build a higher fence, but deer are able to jump 6 or 8 feet or sometimes even more, so it will need to be very tall. If you build a solid fence that they can't see through, it could be a bit shorter, like 6 feet should be okay. Or you can try putting a second fence outside of your garden fence that's too wide for them to cross. If you do like 2, 4, or 5 foot tall fences about 5 feet apart, they probably won't be able to jump both high enough and wide enough, and they probably won't take the risk. And don't forget to reinforce your gate as well, or else they'll just hop in through there. These are more extreme methods, so if you only have an occasional deer, go ahead and try some of the easier methods first. But if you have a really strong deer population in your area, it could be well worth the extra trouble to build a deer fence. Groundhogs. Groundhog damage can look similar to deer damage. They mow down a whole bunch of leaves or fruits all at one time. Obviously, they can't reach as high as deer, so the location of the damage is a main clue. And then look around your yard for any signs of a burrow where a groundhog could be living. Definitely check any like secluded, out of the way corners, like underbrush. It should be obvious if a groundhog dug under your fence, although they could duck under your gate if it isn't secured. So the only other way that they could get in is by climbing over, and they can climb like a 3 or 4 foot fence, but the less secure it is, the less likely they'll be able to get over. So if you think that groundhogs are making their way over your fence, you can try removing the middle posts to make your fence more wobbly. If you want to trap the groundhog, it's usually best to hire a professional because it's illegal to relocate them. It's actually illegal to trap and relocate any wild animal in Virginia. So you can trap it yourself and then get someone else to remove it, or you can have them handle the whole process. And then be sure to fill in the hole really well so that nobody else moves in. Don't attempt to poison a groundhog or any of these pest animals for that matter. It's not going to end well, and in most cases it's also illegal. You are allowed to shoot groundhogs on your own property if that's something that you want to do. So birds, depending on the species, birds can be helpful or annoying to have in the garden. I'll talk about the benefits of birds in a moment, but the birds that eat seeds and fruits can be pretty frustrating because they'll eat some of your crops before they even get the chance to sprout. And they are especially skilled at eating fruits like tomatoes and peppers just one day before you want to. Birds are generally discouraged with shiny moving materials like mylar balloons, CDs, or reflective tape. You can also use scare tactics like these terror eyes balloons, scarecrows, and fake owls or fake snakes. But birds are actually pretty smart, and they pretty soon won't be intimidated anymore. So whichever of these techniques you use, move them around the garden every few days. The more often the better. And consider rotating between multiple strategies. Also, don't start using these too early in the season, or else by the time you really need them, the birds might know by then that they're not actually a threat. And crows in particular are very smart, so you'll need to work extra hard to trick them if you have crows around. And since crows are much larger than most other birds, they eat a lot more, and you may find like hollowed out cucumbers or pulled up corn seedlings or bitten or like even missing tomatoes. They can just fly away with them. So you can focus on protecting seeds in particular by covering them with row cover or any container that won't heat up and cook the sprout as it emerges. Leave the cover on until the seedlings have a few leaves on them because sometimes they will take a very small sprout. You can also cover any particular plants that the birds tend to favor with bird netting. This works best if you only have a couple plants that you want to focus on. Otherwise, it'll be pretty frustrating for you because bird netting is extremely tangly. You can use bird netting to keep away any number of animals, but make sure that it's held really tight at ground level because loose netting will definitely catch birds, snakes, frogs, anything that comes into contact with it. If you really want to keep birds out, you can cover your whole garden with netting, but this is, again, pretty extreme, so you'll want to exhaust all of your other options first. Squirrels. Squirrels are experts at getting into everything. If you're having trouble with squirrels, first make sure that they aren't being attracted to your garden for another reason, like if they have access to a bird feeder right nearby. Squirrel damage is not terribly distinctive, but since they're active during the day, you'll probably be able to spot them out there to be able to figure it out. Your response will depend on exactly how much of a nuisance they're causing. Like if you're having trouble with squirrels taking little bites out of your tomatoes, you can cover the tomato plants, or you can even just cover the ripening fruits individually because they tend to go for the ones that are almost ripe. If they're digging up everything in the garden, you might want to consider more extreme methods like covering the whole thing in bird netting. The methods to keep squirrels away are pretty much the same as for other mammals, like rabbits and deer. Like you can try cayenne pepper, predator urine, and actually human hair. You can try getting a bag of hair from your hairdresser and spreading it around your yard because it has a very human scent. Up to you if you want to try it. You can also encourage owls to live in your yard as they can be good predators of squirrels. So raccoons are omnivorous, so they do eat bugs and snails for you, but they also might go for your vegetables. They do tend to prefer plants that are already starting to rot usually, so they'll probably be more interested in your compost pile than your garden. So if your compost pile is attracting raccoons, make sure that you're adding plenty of those brown materials and burying any fresh food scraps deep into the pile. You can also try leaving out animal products for a while or blocking their access to the pile by switching to a closed bin system or something like a tumbler. Some things that attract raccoons to a yard are garbage cans that are not fully closed, pet food bowls left out at night, and other strong odors like a very hot compost pile. If you've done everything that you can to keep smells down and restrict their access to food, but they still won't leave, you can ask a professional about trapping them. Do not try to trap raccoons on your own. If they're getting into your garden, you can try adding a low string of electric fencing to discourage them from climbing, maybe 6 or 12 inches above the ground. You'll know if a raccoon has been in your garden by its distinctive little handprints. Sometimes skunk prints can look similar to raccoon prints, but you may notice other signs of a skunk, such as a particular odor. Raccoons' favorite crops tend to be corn and melons, so you can protect the ears and the fruit specifically if you've seen raccoons prowling around. So rats are basically like mini raccoons. The same rules apply about properly maintaining your compost, keeping food smells to a minimum, particularly animal products, and restricting their access. They're more likely to be attracted to those things than your vegetables, but if you do find that rats have been living in your compost, you may want to use that compost elsewhere, maybe around some trees or shrubs. Mice and voles. These animals are quite similar to each other, although voles are very partial to digging tunnels along the surface of the ground and like just under, and sometimes they'll create little paths on top of the grass. Mice and voles might eat seeds and small bits of your crops, but they probably won't do any noticeable damage. They're so small that you can't really keep them out of your garden without taking extreme measures, but you really would only need to worry if you notice droppings or obviously any dead rodents, in which case it's definitely time to pull out the traps. Usually the only issues with dogs and cats is digging, or sometimes they might walk or sit on your crops and squish them. Physical barriers like a fence are usually fully effective at keeping cats and dogs out. If your cat is really insisting on climbing into your garden, there's probably a particular reason for it, and you should address that specifically. All right, let's talk about beneficial animals to have around your garden. Moles are relatively neutral on the animal spectrum, but it's good to be able to tell them apart from voles because both will make tunnels running around your yard. But mole tunnels can be identified by the little volcanoes of soil every so often, while the entrances to vole tunnels are much more discreet. While moles have this very unfortunate effect on your lawn, they do eat lots of grubs in the soil and they don't eat plants. Reducing the number of grubs in the soil will help keep moles away, and we'll talk about that in a little while. Possums and skunks are not a threat to your vegetables, and they are really great at keeping insect populations under control. Possums and skunks tend to eat mainly insects, and they can also eat snails, mice, beetles. Possums can eat up to 4,000 ticks per week. They do occasionally eat fruits and vegetables, but it's not likely to be an issue. Obviously, they're probably not something you want to attract to your garden, but if you do see them, make sure that it's not because of garbage or pet food or smelly compost. But hopefully, they will take care of some of your bugs while they're there. So try to let them be unless they're moving into the foundation of your house or something like that. So I've already mentioned birds, how they can be a nuisance, but they can be very beneficial to your garden as well. Some birds eat exclusively seeds, others exclusively insects, but there are many species that will eat both. And there are also actually a lot of birds that will act as pollinators. It's possible to have plenty of birds around your garden and to keep them from disturbing your crops if you do it right. Of course, you can leave out birdseed, and if you do, having multiple feeders is best in different parts of your yard and using multiple different types of seed. Make sure you keep squirrels out if you do this. If you've found that you've now attracted more birds to attack your plants, you might want to back off and focus on milder methods of attracting birds. Planting flowers is a great start, and making sure that birds have cover under shrubs or in trees where they can hide. You should also make sure that they have a water source like a bird bath or a small fountain. You can give them other fruiting plants to munch on, including actually the berries of poison ivy, but that's your call. You can also look into specific strategies on attracting specific bird species because all of them have different benefits for your yard and your garden. So I was just mostly talking about small birds like songbirds, but large birds of prey are really great predators for your garden, and they can keep all kinds of animals, particularly rodents, in check. You can build bird boxes in your trees for owls to encourage them to live in your yard. One concern with raptors, like hawks and owls, is that they might attack the songbirds in your yard. So if you find this happening, you can shoo all the birds away for a couple weeks by removing any food. Both the songbirds and the raptors should leave, but the songbirds should come back much sooner. And you can then create more hiding places for the songbirds where they can eat and shelter under cover rather than congregating at a big bird feeder. Actually, the animals that do the most work by far for reducing bug populations are bats. Bats eat all kinds of bugs, particularly flying insects like wasps, gnats, and moths. Bats can eat around 1,000 mosquitoes per hour, so try to appreciate their presence. You can invite them to your yard by putting up bat houses in the trees, and this can also help keep them from nesting on your house. You'll just need to make sure that they have an open area where they can swoop down to drink water and then swoop right back up again, like a bird bath or anything larger. It's worth mentioning that all bats are protected in Virginia, so don't bother them unless they're inside your house. And bats are actually less likely to have rabies than many other animals. Less than 0.5% of bats carry rabies. But if you do find a dead bat on the ground, you should still use caution and avoid handling it. Snakes are probably not something you want to invite into your garden, but they do play an important role in the ecosystem. So if you have a non-venomous snake, like a black snake, in your yard, obviously there's a lot of factors that you might want to consider, but if you're able to let them live undisturbed, they absolutely will keep your rodent populations in check. Lizards, salamanders, frogs, and toads are all great to have in your garden, and they're all totally harmless. They can help control insects of all kinds, and it may actually be a bad sign if you never see any reptiles or amphibians in your garden because they don't live in areas that are contaminated with chemicals like pesticides and herbicides. Only really small ones will be able to make it through your fence, but you can definitely encourage larger lizards and toads to live in your yard by turning a few ceramic pots upside down and propped up for them to live in. A cool shady spot with plenty of moisture is best for this, and make sure that they have a source of cool water at ground level. Okay, insects. Not all bugs are pests. There are a lot of bugs that are good, even essential to your garden, so don't freak out when you see bugs on your plants. They all have different roles to play in the bug world. The quickest way to get an idea of whether a bug is a friend or foe is to notice whether it's by itself or if there's a lot of them around. Pests are more likely to be seen in groups than predators or pollinators. So if you see a ton of bugs on one plant, there's a good chance that they're a pest. If you see just one bug wandering around on its own, you probably don't need to worry about it. Of course, you can also sometimes tell if they're in the middle of eating your plants, which is a pretty strong sign. And if you do see damage on your plant, look around because the pest may not have gotten very far. If you see a particular bug around your garden pretty often, it's definitely worth trying to figure out what it is. You can describe it to Google and then look through all of the images. You can post a photo online, and obviously you can ask me. Don't squish a bug without identifying it first. If you don't know what it is, leave it alone until you figure it out. This is important because when you kill a pest, another 1 or another 10 will come replace it. But if you accidentally kill a beneficial insect, a good insect, it will be much harder to replace. For example, a single predator insect can keep hundreds of pests in check. So if it's gone, you're waiting for another 1 predator insect to find your garden, while hundreds of pests have free reign. Pests thrive much better in imbalanced ecosystems than beneficial insects do. So you must be very careful with your pest control to keep things from getting out of balance. If you use a pesticide that also kills beneficial insects, your plants will suffer from poor pollination and your pests will come back in even larger numbers. Then you'll really need the spray because you don't have natural controls anymore, and the more out of balance your garden ecosystem will get. One thing that I will say is that when you rely on predators to keep your pests in check, you do have to tolerate having a few pests around. If there are absolutely none, the predators would have nothing left to eat and they would leave. So predators will significantly reduce pest populations, but they won't go all the way down to 0. Sometimes there will just be a few occasional pests and it's no big deal. Other times you might need to do a little supplemental pest control. I will go into the ways to do that in a moment, but first I want to run through the insect life cycle and then I'll show the beneficial insects that I've been talking about. To control a pest as effectively as possible, it's best to understand its life cycle. There are 2 main types. One is egg, then larva, like a grub or a caterpillar, then pupa, which is like the cocoon or chrysalis stage, and then adult. The other type is egg, nymph, then adult. And a nymph is just like a baby version of the adult bug, and it will go through several stages of growth or instars where it just looks a little bit bigger every time, like molting. Depending on the bug, the eggs might be laid in groups or one at a time, which affects how you can control them. You might find a group of eggs and then you can knock down a whole bunch of pests all at once before they can do any damage. But when they're laid one at a time, you're probably not going to find them. Larvae and nymphs do a huge amount of damage because they're growing, so they eat a ton. Pupa don't do any damage because they're sitting still, but in that phase they're pretty well protected from pesticides. Adults often don't do much damage either, but the problem with them is that they're the most mobile, so they can go lay eggs in a new part of your garden. Most of the time, you're aiming to control the caterpillar stage or the nymph stage because that's when they're the most vulnerable. The timing on this varies by pest, but basically you want to catch them after they've hatched, but while they're still very small. Also, many of these bugs have multiple generations throughout the year where they go through this life cycle at least 2 or 3 times. So just when you think you've gotten all of them, more eggs will appear. So you have to stay consistent with pest control all year long, just like with weeds. You can do really well to keep your weeds down all spring, but if they go to seed at the end of the summer, then you just start back at square one. All right, now all of the good bugs that you should be happy to see on your plants. Pollinators, honeybees and butterflies only do some of the pollinating work in the garden. There's actually a huge number of other, much less glamorous insects like flies, wasps, and sweat bees that also spend their days flying around in between the flowers. So be sure to let them do their work. Spiders are always a good sign. There are no crop-eating spiders, and it's very rare that a garden spider would ever harm you. You'll often see wolf spiders and jumping spiders in gardens. Please leave them alone if at all possible, because they are the best hunters in your garden. Jumping spiders and wolf spiders don't sit in a web like other spiders and just wait for prey to come to them. They spend all of their time roaming around your garden looking for insects to eat, and then the web spiders will collect up the rest. So if you come across one in your garden, it's going to run away from you. It doesn't want to fight, so just leave it be. As you've probably heard, ladybugs mainly feed on aphids, and they will also go for a number of other insects as well. They're great predators, which means that they are very popular to buy and release into the garden. They're also notorious for then flying away from the garden. This is for a number of reasons, including the garden not being the right habitat, but mainly they're released at the stage when they naturally want to disperse. So you have to be really determined if you want to get them to stay. So unless you just want to release ladybugs as a fun activity, it's not worth doing. If you see any ladybugs in your garden, there's no need to buy more. Make sure you also look out for ladybug larvae, which look like little black and orange alligators, because they are laser focused on eating aphids. Spotted lady beetles look similar to ladybugs, and their larvae look very similar as well, but they're pink instead of red, and the beetles are more elongated and pointy at the end. These are also great for aphids as well as some other pests and their eggs. Parasitic wasps are a beneficial insect that are extremely helpful to have in the garden for controlling caterpillars, aphids, and a number of other pests. These are not regular wasps. They're extremely tiny and totally harmless to you. They're so small that they could fit on the head of a pin, and some are even microscopic. They kill pests by laying their own eggs into other insect eggs or onto the insect itself. They're also excellent pollinators, and they can do a huge amount of the pollinating work in your garden, so they're a vital creature to have around. You can naturally attract these wasps to your garden with flowers, particularly those that are made up of many smaller flowers, like yarrow, sunflowers, cilantro, and dill. And remember to grow flowers that bloom early in the spring and late into the fall. You can actually buy parasitic wasps as well if you want to make sure that you have plenty in your garden. The most commonly sold is named trichogramma, and it comes as a little strip of paper that has their eggs on it, and you just hang it up in your garden so that they can hatch. It can be a little tricky to get the timing right, so you might want to put them out a few times throughout the spring to make sure they're released when there are caterpillar eggs for them to parasitize. But if you can establish their population, they can help you for years. If you find any flies on your flowers drinking nectar, there is a good chance that those are beneficial parasites just like the wasps. They're called tachinid flies, and they will parasitize every type of pest in your garden. There are so many varieties of these flies that you can't really identify them by looks. They mostly just look like regular flies, but it's best to have as much diversity of these flies in your garden as you can, because they each prey on a different pest. They're also pollinators. They also love those flowers with many individual flowers within them. So be sure to plant lots of flowers from the carrot family and the daisy family in your yard. Beneficial nematodes are microscopic little worms that naturally live in the soil. Even though they're really tiny, they're actually predators too. They can feed on grubs in the soil as well as some insects above ground. And so having healthy soil with plenty of organic matter is the best way to encourage nematodes to live in your soil. And you can buy these as well if you want to establish a new population. Depending on how you buy them, you can apply them to the ground, or you can actually spray them directly on your crops for pest control. Praying mantises are great predators because they eat small pests when they're small, and as they grow bigger, they take on larger pests. You can buy praying mantises to release into your garden, but they eat just about every bug in your garden, good and bad. So I would recommend not overdoing it and just encouraging any that you see already there. They have a really distinctive egg case, so if you find one in your garden, you can protect it to make sure that they'll hatch. Green lacewings are a major workhorse for pest control in the garden, and they do not always get recognition. They're easy to miss because they're so thin and small and light colored, but they will go after aphids, thrips, caterpillars, and more. Their larvae are actually known as aphid lions. You can probably guess why. Lacewings are another insect that you can buy to release into your garden, but you're likely to have at least a few around already. Assassin bugs. These come in a range of colors, but I've mainly seen the gray ones around here. They're another effective predator of a wide variety of pests. They can bite you, but really only if you try to squish them. Their bodies have a pretty distinctive curve, and they have a sort of elephant trunk as a proboscis, so you shouldn't accidentally mistake them for anything else. Centipedes are helpful predators for low-to-the-ground pests. It's not too hard to tell a centipede apart from a millipede. Millipedes are more dome-shaped with their legs tucked underneath them, while centipedes are flatter with their legs out to the side. Centipedes are also much faster, and they'll run if you disturb them, while millipedes will usually just curl up. Millipedes are decomposers, and I will talk about them in a bit. If you see centipedes in your garden, it's best not to handle them because some are able to bite, but they are good predators to have around. Spined soldier bugs. These are a tricky one because they look almost exactly like stink bugs, but they're actually predators. The way that you can tell them apart is by looking at the black spot on the very back of their wings. Soldier bugs have them, and stink bugs have just more of like a steady color there. They also have very pointy shoulders. Stink bugs can have really pointy shoulders too, but soldier bugs are these really sharp thorns. Soldier bugs will feed on the larvae of just about every pest, so finding one of these among stink bugs is like finding a lucky clover. Soldier beetles and fireflies can look similar to one another, but luckily they're both beneficial. Soldier beetles have a more plain coloring on their heads, and as adults they're pollinators, while the larvae can act as predators. Fireflies look more like sunflower seeds with the yellow borders around their wings. Firefly adults and larvae are great slug predators in addition to cutworms and aphids, plus they're really fun to have around. So definitely make sure that you're looking out for all of these beneficial insects in your garden because they're helping you a lot more than you will ever realize. But like I said, they will not control every pest, and for various reasons, sometimes your pests will get out of control. Other than having a diverse garden and focusing on attracting beneficial insects, the other way generally to discourage pests from your garden is to make sure you have very healthy plants. I've mentioned before that plants have their own version of an immune system, and a strong, healthy plant is much better able to fight an infestation than a weak one. You can make sure that you have strong plants by building healthy soil, fertilizing when necessary, but being very careful not to over-fertilize, and preventing your plants from getting stressed out from issues like too much heat and not enough water. But even so, you will still have some pests, so what can you do? The main defense for larger pests is picking them off of your plants one by one. Yes, this is time-consuming, but not nearly as much as you would think. It's really the most practical option for a small garden, and the time isn't that different from using other methods. You can just put on a pair of gloves and either pinch the bugs or drop them into a container of soapy water to kill them. Remember to collect and squish their eggs as well if you can find them. For smaller pests that aren't possible to grab by hand, there are a couple of other methods I'll talk about. And then if you have a bad infestation or too large of a garden to do everything by hand, then we move into sprays. Different types of insecticides each only work against certain types of insects because bugs are all so different. Some are soft and squishy, some have hard shells, some eat plants, others eat other bugs. and each insecticide targets them in different ways, so you have to choose the right one for the pest. Make sure that the insecticide you choose is specifically approved for the pest that you're trying to control, and consider whether the others that are listed on the label are something that you want to kill or keep. While it can be annoying to have to use more than one method for multiple different pests, this is overall a very good thing because it helps with maintaining that natural balance instead of accidentally wiping out all of your butterflies and bees. Also, think carefully about the combinations of methods that you might be using. Like, let's say you're working on building up beneficial insects to control the caterpillars in your garden. If at the same time you spray all of the caterpillars in your garden, the beneficial insects are not going to want to live there. So you have to resist the urge and just pick them by hand instead. If you buy an insecticide, most are available in two forms: concentrate and ready to use. Ready-to-use sprays are pre-diluted with water, while concentrates only contain the active ingredients. So if you plan to use the spray with any regularity, the concentrates are a better deal because you aren't paying for gallons and gallons of water. But for most things, you probably won't be able to use an entire bottle of concentrate, so it may be worth having the convenience of ready-to-use. Always read the label very carefully and follow all of the instructions and safety precautions. You have to do this every time you use a new product. When you spray it onto your plants, also make sure to spray the entire plant, especially the undersides of the leaves where pests really like to hide. And different sprays have different application rates, and usually on the label it'll refer to whether there's enough spray on the leaf for it to drip off or not. So some will say spray to the point of runoff or to the point of near runoff. So that's a pretty full coverage. That means the spray is dripping off of the leaves. And then the reapplication rate also varies by the spray, but oftentimes they'll recommend spraying a week later or even every week. All right, so let's get into the list of methods. So hand picking, of course, is the least risky method of pest control if it's a pest that you can do that with and you've properly identified it. Row cover fabric can also be very effective against certain pests. It's just a white fabric with a frame of metal hoops to hold it up that you use to protect your crops. You can buy the fabric in different thicknesses, and the thickest ones can be used to keep your plants warm in the wintertime, but the thinnest type are good for summertime use to keep insects out. And this is great for flying insects because their access is blocked. The times when row cover does not work is when the pest is in the soil or so small that it might already be there. So like wireworms and flea beetles, which we'll talk about. Of course, it's also not very practical for tall crops, although it can be done. And finally, vegetables that need to be pollinated, so like squash and okra, have to be uncovered when they're flowering to allow bees and other pollinators access. So in this case, you can cover the plants up until they start flowering, or to protect against nocturnal pests like moths, you can cover them at night, but then uncover them during the day when the bees are active. When you're using row cover for pest control, it's best to put the row cover on right after planting so that the pests never get the chance to find your plants. If you wait until you see the bugs, it's too late to use row cover. You should also make sure that the edges of the fabric are sealed really well. You can use weights, but this is best achieved by burying the edges into the soil. And it's good to check underneath the fabric occasionally to make sure that there aren't pests trapped inside. Surround is a brand of kaolin clay, just a type of clay, which can be sprayed onto your crops to give them a white coating that repels insects. It doesn't kill them, it just repels them. So it protects your crops without changing the balance of predators and prey in your garden. This is a great general purpose method because it's essentially harmless and it will repel just about everything. But with this in mind, avoid dusting flowers with the clay because it will repel pollinators. It also has a cooling effect on your crops pretty significantly, and it can help prevent them from getting sunburned. Clay has essentially no risk of harming the environment, so even though it makes your garden look kind of scary, I recommend this as your first option if you do need to spray against pests. Diatomaceous earth is a white powder that's actually made up of crushed fossils. On the micro scale, these fossils are extremely sharp to insects and will cut up their bodies, and eventually they'll die from dehydration. Not the most pleasant way to go, but it can definitely be effective. You can sprinkle it on the ground. A thick band of it tends to work the best. And you apply it only right where you know the pests will walk over it, because diatomaceous earth will kill beneficial insects as well as pests. Don't apply it near flowers because it can be harmful to bees. So to avoid getting any dust on bees, apply late in the evening when bees are not active, and make sure that there's no wind for it to spread onto other areas. Bacillus thuringiensis, or BT for short, is a naturally occurring soil bacteria that's commonly used in agriculture for pest control. It's helpful for controlling caterpillars in particular, and can be sprayed with relatively low environmental risk. Although it will affect all caterpillars, including beneficial butterflies, so you should only spray it if truly necessary. There are multiple different strains of BT, and not all of them are approved for organic gardening. So make sure that you choose BT var Kerstaki, usually BTK, for controlling caterpillars. A common brand name for BTK is Dipel. The earlier you spray it, the smaller the caterpillars are, so the more effective it will be. You will probably need to make one application when the caterpillars are really small, and then another one a week later. It will take the caterpillars a few days to die, so you don't need to apply more if you still see them the next day. BT has to be applied at the right time to be effective, and it's a pretty small window, so it's best to keep notes of when you first see pests in your garden so that the following year you can anticipate them. Neem oil is extracted from the neem tree, and it's a pretty common pesticide and fungicide. Neem oil is most effective against small, soft-bodied insects like aphids, thrips, and whiteflies, but it can also work against beetles and caterpillars. It should only be applied late in the evening to make sure that no honeybees come into contact with it, and measure carefully because a high concentration can damage your plants. If for some reason you need a very strong insecticide, the strongest that I can recommend is spinosad, which is mainly used for caterpillars. Again, controlling caterpillars with sprays is risky because it will kill beneficial caterpillars as well. Spinosad will also kill bees and potentially other beneficial insects like ladybugs, so it must be applied very late in the evening. In a small garden, you shouldn't ever need this, but if you've tried everything else and it isn't enough, this is your last option. Now the pesticides I don't recommend. I don't really recommend insecticidal soap because I don't think it's that effective, but it is something that you can try if you want to. It works on small, soft-bodied insects like aphids, whiteflies, and thrips. It won't work on caterpillars, beetles, wasps, or anything else. You can buy ready-made insecticidal soap, or you can make your own. But if you make your own, use pure soap and water. To be safe for your garden, this soap must be only a pure Castile soap made from vegetable oils with no fragrances, detergents, moisturizers, or any other additives. Dr. Bronner's is a good brand for this. Be sure to use a very dilute spray that's mostly water with only a tiny bit of soap to avoid potentially burning the foliage of your plants. Also keep in mind that it only works on direct contact with the bugs, and it isn't really effective once it's dry, so you have to find the bugs and spray them all directly. If you're doing that, it's just as easy to scrape them off of the plants. Also, lastly, if you find yourself trying to get aphids off your plants fairly regularly, it's time to figure out the cause instead of just treating them. Something I don't really recommend is pyrethrum or pyrethrin. Pyrethrin is legal for organic farming, but it's extremely strong and it shouldn't ever be necessary for a small garden. You might see the brand name as Pyganic. It also kills beneficial insects and is toxic to aquatic animals. It can also irritate your skin and your lungs when it's handled. So if you maintain a diverse garden and you use gentler methods to prevent pests from getting out of control, you should never need to use strong pesticides. So I definitely don't recommend using any product that isn't OMRI listed because it's much more likely to be unsafe for beneficial insects. I also don't usually recommend using insecticide sprays as a preventative unless you've kept really good track from previous years and you know that you're going to have the pest. You really can't do it without the spray. You know when the bug will be arriving and everything. Spraying insecticides unnecessarily can actually just help your pests build up a resistance to them. So it's always best to start with the gentlest, least risky methods and then work your way up to an insecticide treatment if necessary. In general, I also do not recommend any DIY homemade pesticides or herbicides or anything else either. There's a lot of really crazy recipes people put on the internet, and just because they're made with household ingredients, that does not mean that they're safe for your garden. Some of those ingredients are entirely capable of killing beneficial insects and adding toxicity to your soil without you really realizing. So I'm talking about ingredients like salt, vinegar, garlic, oils, all kinds of stuff that you might see. So when you're doing pest control, it's best to work with physical controls first, where you're just removing the bugs, or with chemicals that are made for pest control and regulated for safety, like they're specifically meant for it. Alright, now let's dig into the details of the most likely pests you might see hanging around your garden. Mexican bean beetles. These look just like ladybugs, but they're an orangey brown copper color instead of red. And if you see the adult beetles, you're also almost sure to see their very telltale larvae as well. They're bright yellow. They look like little hedgehogs. And then their eggs are like tiny yellow grains of rice standing on their end. You can find bean beetles on every type of bean, particularly on the underside of the leaves, usually the most sheltered leaves, like down towards the bottom. But once an infestation gets bad, they'll start in on the beans themselves as well. They don't really eat the beans, but they make them all misshapen and have brown spots on them. They will also skeletonize the leaves where they eat it all the way down to just the veins, which makes the plants suffer and they produce a lot less. And these do have multiple generations throughout the summer, just one after the other. So be sure that you check your beans at least a couple of times a week to squish the beetles and their eggs. Because the more eggs you find, the fewer beetles you'll have to deal with. So since they usually hide so deep into the plant, sprays don't always get them. So picking the beetles by hand is usually the best method. If you do spray, you can use Surround as a preventative or Spinosad as a really strong treatment, and just make sure you focus on the underside of the leaves. To prevent bean beetles, you can use row cover for the entire season because beans don't actually need to be pollinated by bees or anything. Just make sure that you check inside often. There's another beetle that looks the same as the bean beetle with the orange coloring and everything, but it's just a little larger with larger spots. You can usually guess which is which, squash beetle and bean beetle, by whether they're on a bean plant or a squash plant. Their larvae are a similar yellow, but they have longer black spikes on them. This is a pretty minor pest. I only ever see them rarely, but it's worth mentioning in case you confuse it with a bean beetle. Japanese beetles, you will find these on everything. They're a relatively large round beetle with an iridescent color, sort of a greenish head and then brownish purplish wings. They have a very large appetite and they can fly a pretty good distance to your garden. Hand picking is effective, but you have to get good at catching them because they will drop to the ground or they'll fly away if they see you coming. So I use a method of attempting to catch them with one hand while holding the glass of soapy water underneath them with the other hand. So the reason that Japanese beetles are so prolific is because their larvae survive really well in lawns. They'll spend the winter under the grass, chewing on grass roots, and in bad cases they can actually kill some of the grass, and then they emerge in the summer and eat all of your crops. Luckily, you can get long-term control for Japanese beetles by using a bacteria called milky spore or milky spore disease. You can spread this bacteria over your entire lawn to kill the grubs, and if you do it correctly, it should control the beetles for a number of years, although it may take a couple years for it to be fully effective. August and September is the best time to apply because that is when the grubs are the most active in the soil. Beneficial nematodes can also be effective. You can buy Heterorhabditis bacteriophora or Steinernema feltiae, often shortened to initials HB and SF. Those can be applied in the spring as well as the fall, but you'll probably need to reapply them more often because it's more difficult for them to establish a population. Also, usually the HB nematode is more effective than the SF, but they both can work. Since milky spore and beneficial nematodes are both alive and need host grubs to feed on, they won't be effective if you don't have very many grubs in your soil, and they won't be able to build up a strong population. So if you don't have a really bad Japanese beetle infestation, it's best to just handpick them. If you do decide to treat the grubs in the soil, pick just one method, milky spore or nematodes, because if you combine them, they could work against each other. And you still probably will get some beetles from your neighbors, but there should be a pretty noticeable improvement. And the fewer larvae you have in your soil, the less likely critters like skunks and moles will be to come into your yard and dig around looking for them. I will say that if you see grubs in your soil, some of them will be pest beetles like Japanese beetles, but some of them are beneficial beetles, and the grubs look extremely similar. So unless you want to identify all of their really small differences, I recommend just letting them be when you see grubs in the soil. There's also another variety of BT called BTG that can be used against adult beetles and beetle grubs in the ground, but it's less specific than milky spore or beneficial nematodes, and there's a chance that it could harm other insects. So it's an option, but it's definitely not the preferred option. There are also some parasitic wasps that will naturally control the Japanese beetle, so definitely grow flowers to attract them, and remember that these wasps will not hurt you. You may see Japanese beetle traps at the store, but these will almost always backfire and bring more beetles to your garden than you had before, and not trapping nearly as many of them as they bring. June bugs are a close relative to Japanese beetles, and they can be treated in the same way. These are the really giant green beetles that you might see flying around your lawn. Okay, so stink bugs, like we talked about soldier bugs. You're probably familiar with stink bugs. These are the brown shield-shaped insects that don't smell great when they get squished. Stink bugs do feed on plants, but they're usually not a major pest. If you see an occasional stink bug, you can leave it alone in case it might actually be a soldier bug, and remember to check for that little dot. But if you're sure that you have stink bugs causing crop damage, you can either handpick them or you can try surround that kale and clay. Harlequin bugs are very easily distinguishable with their very bright markings. The adults have the shield shape of a stink bug, but the young nymphs are very cute and round with stripes on their backs. Their eggs are also very distinguishable because they have a black and white striped pattern to them. Their favorite crops are the brassica family, the broccoli, kale, and cabbage, but you might find them on just about anything. Sometimes you think you don't have very many and then they multiply really suddenly, so keep an eye out for these ones. Handpicking is the best for harlequin beetles, or you could use spinosad for a really bad infestation. Row cover can also be effective, but make sure that you check underneath fairly regularly. Alright, squash bugs look similar to a stink bug at first glance, but they have a more elongated body instead of that shield shape, and they prefer to hang out on squash, of course. You might also see them on cucumbers and melons. Their nymphs are white and they lay little amber-colored eggs. They're pretty quick, so if you see a squash bug, it will probably try and run and hide. So check under dead leaves, dead squash leaves on the ground, things like that. And you can try and eliminate any hiding spots for next time, Or you can use this to your advantage. Like you can put something like a piece of wood under a squash plant overnight and then come out in the morning to find them all congregated under there. If you're having issues with squash bugs, you may want to clear away any mulch under your squash plants so they can't hide from you. These can cause pretty significant wilt in your squash plants, so make sure that you catch these early. And hand picking is usually best, but just so you're warned, if you squish them, they bleed blue and they also have a very distinctive odor. Flea beetles. These are not fleas. They won't bite you or jump onto your dog or anything. They're just called that because they're tiny and really great jumpers. They're just these shiny little black dots, and they make tiny shotgun holes in the leaves of a number of different plants. You're most likely to see them on potatoes and radishes. This does weaken your plants, but in most cases it's not going to do too much harm. It's just going to be mostly cosmetic. Hand picking is definitely not practical for these guys. So you can decide if you can just tolerate them, or you could try a spray if they're really out of control. Surround can work well for flea beetles, and spinosad is effective, but it should never get that extreme. Flea beetles are another favorite of parasitic wasps. I don't really recommend using row cover for flea beetles because even if you put it on tightly right after you plant, there could be flea beetles in the soil already and you could just trap them inside, but if you do it carefully, row cover is effective against flea beetles. Okay, so Colorado potato beetles can be a really serious pest if you encounter them. They can eat an entire potato crop, but since I have lived here, I've only found false potato beetles, which prefer to eat weeds like horse thistle over crops. So if you see these, it's not cause for panic quite yet. First watch them and see what they're eating. If they're stripping the leaves off of your crops, you can feel free to get rid of them. But if they're sticking to weeds, there's a very good chance that they're false. The most obvious difference between true and false potato beetles is that the false beetles have a brown stripe in the middle of their back, while the true beetles just continue their pattern with a black stripe in the middle. The Colorado potato beetle also tends to have more yellowish stripes, while the false beetle has more whitish, but this can vary slightly. But their larvae are different colors. The false beetle has like a grayish-white larva, while the Colorado potato beetle has a reddish-orange. If you find false potato beetles on your crop, you can just hand pick those and it probably won't be much of an issue. If you do end up with Colorado potato beetles and you're certain that that's what they are, there's a special variety of BT called BT var San Diego that you can use, but it must be applied to the larva right after hatching to be effective. Cucumber beetles. These are small, elongated beetles with striped and spotted varieties, which are pretty much equivalent. You can find them on all squash family plants. They usually only do a small amount of damage, mostly just cosmetic, if anything, but they can also transmit bacterial wilt onto the squash plants. You can use row cover to keep them out up until your squash starts flowering, and then you can also plant bacterial wilt resistant varieties if you find that to be an issue. They're a bit small for hand picking, but neem oil may work, or spinosad for a really serious infestation. I would recommend that you keep insecticide use to an absolute minimum around plants in the squash family because bees really love squash blossoms and this is where they'll spend most of their time in the garden. So it's the place of greatest risk for harming bees. Squash vine borer. The adults look kind of like an orange and black wasp, but you're not really likely to see the adults. The main issue is the larvae, which burrow into the base of your squash plants and cause them to gradually wilt and die. If you start to notice any type of wilt on your squash, check the base of the plant for any holes or piles of frass, which is their excrement. If there is a borer in your plant, you can try surgery by sticking a wire through the hole or slicing open the plant to try to kill the larva before covering the wound up with soil. This can be worth a try because even if the plant doesn't survive, the borer would have killed it anyway. But be mindful that there's oftentimes more than one worm in the plant, and sometimes they're small, too small or too high up in the plant for you to find them all, so then they could continue growing and then become an adult if your plant is still infected. If you have plants infected with squash vine borers, I suggest that you chop them up very, very finely to kill any more potential larvae hiding inside, or just throw the plants into garbage bags. They usually only have 2 generations each summer, so planting your squash in successions will ensure that even if some plants are affected, your earliest and latest successions should be fine. Usually they're active around June and July. Insecticides aren't very effective because the adults are so elusive and the larvae hide inside of the plant. So the best thing that you can do for vine borers is just try to prevent them in the first place. You can make little collars around the base of the plant with something like aluminum foil to block the moths from laying their eggs, although it is possible that they could try laying them higher up on the plant. Covering all of your squash with row cover can protect them when the moths are active. Once the plants are flowering, you can uncover them during the day for pollination and then cover them back up at night for protection against the moths if you're really devoted. Pickleworms are a light greenish colored moth larva, sometimes with black spots on them. They can bore a very clean little drill hole into your squash and then eat it from the inside. Sometimes you will see their frass outside of the hole. They prefer soft summer squash like zucchini, but you may also find them in cucumbers. There's a similar larva called a melonworm that prefers cantaloupe. Earlier in the season, they might feed on squash flowers and reduce the number of squash that you get. Generally, they'll arrive around mid to late summer, a little bit later than the vine borer. If you don't notice the hole, it can be a very unpleasant surprise when you cut open the squash. But if it's only on one end of the squash, the other end will be unaffected and you can still eat it if you want. Like squash vine borers, the moths are very sneaky and hard to control, and insecticide sprays have pretty low effectiveness. So the best practices are planting early before they have the chance to arrive, and just planting more than you need if you find this to be an issue. Row cover can also be effective, but since they arrive later in the summer, you'll probably have to commit to covering and uncovering the plants daily because they'll be flowering. For pickleworm, this may only be worthwhile if you know that they're an issue for you. Corn worms, there are a number of different caterpillars that feed on corn, including corn earworm, corn borer, and armyworm, and these aren't always easy to tell apart, but luckily they can be grouped together and treated in the same way. They will eat any part of the corn plant, but the most frustrating is when they get into the ear. Depending on the species, the worm may go in through the top of the ear and only damage the tip, which you can just cut off, or it might burrow right through the husk into the very middle of the ear. And these caterpillars are not strictly limited to corn. You may find them elsewhere in the garden too. In fact, the corn earworm and the tomato fruitworm are the same species, but you just name them by the crop that you find them on. The eggs are laid one at a time and at night, so it's pretty much impossible to find the moths or the eggs. Usually by the time you find the caterpillars, they're quite large and it's too late, so it's best to focus on prevention. One thing that you can try is coating the silks of the corn ear in vegetable oil or mineral oil to try to block them from getting in through the top that way. Planting corn early can also help decrease the effects of caterpillars, and there are also some resistant varieties of corn. And trichogramma or other parasitic wasps and other predators should be able to handle some of the eggs for you, find those individual eggs. You can also try spraying beneficial nematodes on the ears. And if you have a lot of corn or a lot of caterpillars, BT is usually the way to go. You may have heard of BT corn. This is a type of corn that's genetically modified to create BT for the exact purpose of preventing these caterpillars because it's such a common problem. A weekly spray up until the corn is done silking should be enough to keep them away. So cutworms are not a specific insect, it's a general term for moth caterpillars, and they're named that because they'll sometimes eat the base of a seedling, like effectively cutting it off at ground level. Sometimes they'll also climb and do damage higher up. They all look pretty different from one another, so you can identify them by kind of their general size and shape and the way that they roll up into like a little round C. They feed mainly at night, so try looking for them late in the evening. Sometimes you can also just see them sitting on the ground next to your plants, so keep an eye out there. They don't always do a noticeable amount of damage, but if they do, and you can't pick them all by hand, you can try putting diatomaceous earth on the ground around new sprouts or new transplants. If it's really bad, you can spray BT on your new plantings, but once your plants have grown up a little bit, they're not likely to be much of an issue. Okay, tomato hornworms are a notorious pest in vegetable gardens, and that's for good reason. These caterpillars grow extremely large, 3 or 4 inches long, and they can eat a tomato plant down very quickly. They're relatively distinctive, and they have a red spike on their rear. If you pick them up, they'll curl that spike towards you, but it's totally harmless. They can't sting you or bite you. Tomato hornworms are experts at camouflage. Like, you can be staring right at one without knowing it's there, so you kind of have to train your eye to see them. So if you find a section of your plant where the leaves have been stripped off, sometimes you can also see bites taken out of the tomatoes themselves. You can pretty much guarantee that there's a hornworm nearby. So you'll probably see their excrement on the leaves, and the size of it tells you how large of a caterpillar you're looking for. So whether it's tiny little flecks or like bumpy rabbit-sized pellets. So look near those bare stems and above the droppings, and you should be able to find it pretty quickly. So the smaller you catch them, the less damage they can do, of course. So check your plants really often for signs of damage. Also, I'll brush their droppings off after finding one so that if I see more, then I know that there's another caterpillar. If you have a very large tomato planting and a lot of hornworms, you can spray BT for them, but hand picking will definitely do just fine for a small garden. It's pretty hard to get used to hand picking hornworms off of plants, so you can wear gloves if that makes it easier for you. My method is pretty much to just grab them essentially around the scruff of the neck, and then you may need to grab onto the plant at the same time to pry them off because they will hold on tight. And you can put them in soapy water, or you can just squish them under your foot, but they will squirt if you do that. If you see a hornworm with these white little grains of rice all over it, leave it alone. These are the eggs of a parasitic wasp that will hunt and kill the hornworms for you. So by letting it be, you're giving the eggs a chance to hatch so they can go find more worms and keep them out of your garden. If you find holes in your brassicas, like big bites, so like on cabbage or kale, there's a good chance that you have cabbage loopers and or cabbage white caterpillars. The loopers have sort of more defined segments to them, while the cabbage whites are soft and smooth, but both can do a pretty significant amount of damage to your brassica crops. They start out very small, and they can be very hard to spot because they're pretty much the exact same color as the leaves. So check the very center of the plant where all the new leaves are clustered together. Check the upper and the lower sides of the leaves for these caterpillars. And sometimes you might find them like covered in a little spiderwebby cocoon. You may only have one on a plant, but you may also have a number of them. So hand picking is usually effective, especially if you look for them at the first signs of any damage to the leaves or any frass on the plants, or even if you're preventatively checking before then. But since brassicas do not need pollination, since you're just eating the leaves and everything, row cover can be an effective solution as well. And they are caterpillars, so BT is effective on them, but it may not be necessary. And parasitic wasps are a really good predator of these as well. Wireworms are a main pest of root crops like carrots and potatoes, although they really don't do that much damage usually. They drill holes into the root, but they don't actually eat it, so you can usually just cut around it. They're long, thin, orangey little beetle larvae. They can be difficult to control since they live in the soil, but beneficial nematodes are definitely helpful, and tilling up the soil will expose the worms for birds to eat. Unless you're seeing significant damage to your root crops, you shouldn't have to worry too much about wireworms. Carrot rust fly damage can look quite similar to wireworm damage. They carve tunnels into and around the outside of your carrots, It's probably carrot rust fly if you aren't finding any signs of wireworms on your other root crops or just in the soil. If you want to be sure, you can cut open the infected carrots to look for tiny little white maggots. Just be sure to throw all infected carrots in the garbage instead of the compost because there may be eggs or larvae inside that could still hatch. Row cover is the most effective for preventing carrot rust fly. Just be sure to cover them up again quickly when you're finished. Additionally, it's best to avoid growing carrots all year round so that you can help break the fly's life cycle. Aphids are a classic garden pest. I mentioned previously that aphids are generally a sign of a weak plant, so prevention involves making sure that your plants aren't over-fertilized and minimizing their stress. If you're finding aphids on multiple plants, there's a good chance that there's too much nitrogen in your soil, or maybe there has been some extreme weather recently. You'll usually see aphids on the new growing tips of the plant, but sometimes they'll also be on the very base of the plant, like just slightly underground. And they're often green, but they can actually come in any number of different colors. They suck on plant leaves, weakening them, but individually they don't do too much damage. It's usually just a problem when you see them in a cluster. So if you see a small number on your plants, it might be enough to just brush them off, or you can spray them with a strong jet of water. But if you can, it's best to squish them because if you just knock them down, there's a chance that ants will pick them up and put them back on the plants again. This is because in some cases ants will farm aphids just like humans farm dairy cows. They'll protect them from predators and disease. They'll move them around onto plants so that the ants can eat the aphid's honeydew or excrement. If you have a farming situation, which you can usually identify by a huge number of aphids on one plant, you can focus on getting rid of the aphids or the ants or both. And I recommend both, and I'll talk about ants in a moment. So to control aphids, if you have a badly infested plant, it's usually just best to pull it out and put it in the trash if you can spare it. If it's an important plant that you're not ready to get rid of and you're not able to scrape them all off, you can apply neem oil onto the aphids, or aphids are one of the few pests that insecticidal soap is effective against, so you can go ahead and try that if you would prefer. Okay, to get rid of ants, you can try a mix of borax and sugar around their nests, or artificial sweeteners as a bait. Diatomaceous earth will also work, but it could take a couple of weeks for that, which isn't too practical. You can also try pouring boiling water into their nest every couple days for a week or so to try to get rid of them. Beneficial nematodes can also help to get rid of ants. But generally speaking, outside of aphid farming, seeing ants in your garden is definitely not a bad sign. They can act as pollinators, predators, and decomposers, and they really do very little damage to plants. You really only need to get rid of them if they're farming aphids. Or just otherwise really bothering you and making you not want to spend time in your garden. But if you can tolerate them, just know they're doing a lot more good than harm. Also, not all red ants are fire ants, so just because you see red ants, that doesn't mean that you have to kill them. But if you do have fire ants, I won't blame you for deciding to get rid of them. Slugs and snails are most active late at night, but if you see a shiny trail on a damaged leaf, you can be pretty sure that they're to blame. They tend to go for crops that are low to the ground, particularly in shady spots that hold extra dampness. They're also able to eat entire seedlings occasionally. If you have slug damage in a mulched area, try removing the mulch for a while. First thing in the morning is usually the best time to check for slug trails and snail trails, and you can look for the slugs and snails themselves late in the evening or early in the morning to hand pick them like you would with cutworms. You may have heard of using beer traps for slugs, and this sometimes works, but it can also backfire, bringing more slugs to your garden than before, and sometimes they do just go into the beer and then right back out again. You can make natural traps for them by giving them places to hide, like an overturned board, a pile of old lettuce leaves, some other dark, damp place, and then just check it every day to kill any slugs underneath. Just don't forget about this or it will backfire too. And when you kill slugs, you need to remove them from your garden because when slugs smell other dead slugs, it actually draws them to the area. You may have also heard about using diatomaceous earth for slugs, and while they don't like to cross it, it doesn't actually kill them because they're protected by their mucus. I don't recommend applying diatomaceous earth as just a wall against slugs or snails because it will kill any insect that walks across it, including slug-eating predators. And remember, diatomaceous earth is only effective when it's dry, and slugs prefer to move around when the weather is wet anyway. Just having slugs in your garden is also not a bad thing. They're decomposers, they're an important part of the food chain. It's only if they're damaging your crops that it becomes a problem. If they're not doing major damage, you can just learn to live with them. But if you do have to use a snail bait, Sluggo or other iron phosphate baits are the safest. So of course there are many more, but those will probably be your most common pests. Now here are some other insects that you might see which are more or less neutral to have in the garden. Earwigs are omnivores, which sort of puts them in a gray area. They are predators, so they can keep aphid and slug populations down, but occasionally they will go after your crops as well. I would leave them alone unless they're causing a specific problem, in which case you can trap them and then move them elsewhere. If you don't know where they're hiding, small tubes like a roll of newspaper or a hollow piece of bamboo can usually attract them over the course of a few days. You may see little frothy spots on your leaves that look, quite frankly, like spit, but this is a small insect that's known as a frog hopper, and while they do feed on plants, their damage is negligible and you shouldn't need to worry about trying to remove them. Leaf-footed bugs are also pretty neutral. They can cause some cosmetic damage, but it's not worth killing them unless you have a whole lot of them. They look very similar to squash bugs, but they have a flat leaf-shaped section on their back legs. They also have a slightly more rounded abdomen, and the juveniles are red instead of white. False milkweed bugs can look a little bit alarming, but they're pretty much neutral to have in the garden. The true milkweed bug looks almost exactly like it, but it feeds only on milkweed. The false bug you might find on milkweed and other plants as well, but it's rare that they'll cause a problem. Pillbugs, these don't have a real name. Pillbugs, roly-polies, woodlice, and their close cousin, the sow bug. They're mainly decomposers. They'll eat stuff that's already on the ground or starting to rot, but they are opportunistic, so they might occasionally get into your crops, particularly anything that has damage already. But this should only happen rarely, and it's best to just forgive them if you can, because they help break down organic matter, and they're a good food source for beneficial animals like spiders and frogs, so that you can keep them around. If you do find that happening often, remove any mulch from under the affected plants, and then you can use diatomaceous earth if you're still having an issue. Millipedes are another helpful decomposer that can get caught up in your crops occasionally. If you see them in or on your soil, it's no problem. But if you find them feeding on a crop, you can keep them away with diatomaceous earth if you need to. So gulf fritillary caterpillars, sometimes swallowtail caterpillars, and other beneficial butterfly caterpillars may occasionally munch on your crops. If you find butterfly caterpillars on your crops, it's best to move them to another location and avoid killing them if you can. Alright, now plant diseases. There are plenty of vegetable diseases out there, and the majority of them thrive in warm, humid climates with plenty of rain. So we're at a bit of a disadvantage living here, but we do what we can. For all plant diseases, the best thing that you can do is prevent them in the first place. The most general way to prevent disease is to just try to keep your plants as stress-free as you can. Most of these diseases have a much harder time taking hold on really healthy plants, and this can make a significant difference. So this means not over-fertilizing, reducing pest pressure, building healthy soil, and managing their water intake as well as possible, among other things. Most plant diseases are transmitted through water, which is why it's important to not spray your leaves when you're watering. Keep the leaves as dry as possible, and when they are wet after rain or from morning dew, try to avoid handling them if at all possible. The majority of these diseases thrive in very humid conditions and do not grow well in any kind of wind, So make sure that your plants have plenty of airflow, both between the plants and through the leaves of the plants. It's okay if you need to prune out a few leaves of a really dense plant, especially close to the ground where it's the most humid. It's also important to clear away weeds underneath the plants, which could keep the ground from drying out completely and making a little humid pocket. You should also make sure that you stay on top of pests like cucumber beetles and aphids because they can spread a few of these diseases in between plants. Some of the diseases come in from wind, in which case you should take other defensive measures for prevention, but others come in on infected seeds, soil, and transplants. So buy seeds and plants carefully. Inspect plants for any signs of disease, and buy certified disease-free seeds if possible. One of the main defenses against many of these diseases is disease-resistant crops. These varieties have been specifically bred to resist the disease, which can make the difference between your plant surviving the season or not. However, resistant varieties are not immune, so you do still need to take other precautions. And Johnny's Seed Company is a good resource for resistant seed varieties. You should definitely focus on planting resistant varieties after a significant disease outbreak on any particular crop because there is a good chance that it will be back in the following year. You must also save seeds extremely carefully if you want to prevent disease, but we'll talk about that in the fall. Many of these diseases can survive the winter in the soil, but many of them also have specific crop families that they live on, which is one of the reasons why crop rotation is so important. If you end up with a disease in your soil, you won't have the correct host plant growing there next year, which means that your plants are less likely to get infected and the disease may starve in the soil. The farther you move each plant family away from where it was planted the previous year, the better odds you have against infection. Check your plants regularly for signs of disease. The earlier you catch it, the better chance you have of your plant surviving and the disease not spreading through your garden. If you have a lot of other plants in your yard, like flowers and bushes, make sure you're checking those periodically as well because they can have the same diseases as your vegetables and transmit them to each other. And finally, you can use preventative sprays to stop diseases from taking hold. If you see an infected plant in your garden, first, of course, try to identify the infection. Some diseases are more serious than others. Some you should remove the plant immediately if possible because spread could cause disaster for your garden for many years. For others, it's not that big a deal and won't kill your plant. So remove infected leaves or plants as quickly as possible. Clean them up if they're on the ground, if any leaves are on the ground, and be sure to throw them in the garbage, not in the compost, not on a burn pile, or else the spores can continue to spread. And when you're pruning your crops like tomatoes, especially if they're showing signs of disease, it's a good idea to disinfect your pruners with a bleach solution in between plants or even between every cut to prevent the spread of disease. So what are these sprays? There are two main fungicides that are used in organic gardening. The first is a brand name named Serenade, and this is actually a bacteria named Bacillus subtilis. This is a beneficial bacteria that you spray onto your plants and they will colonize the leaves, effectively blocking anything else from taking hold. This is a very gentle and safe preventative spray and the best first-line defense against fungi and bacteria. Copper fungicide is quite a bit stronger. It can help stop early-stage diseases from spreading further. I recommend that you start using copper sprays only after the first sign of disease because copper can build up in your soil and damage the garden. Overuse can also potentially burn plant leaves. Although copper sprays are usually called copper fungicide, they can also be effective against bacteria. In some cases, sulfur is recommended as the most effective fungicide. This should only be used when specifically recommended, mainly for rust, but in extreme cases, it can also be used for botrytis and powdery and downy mildews. And only on brassicas, onions, and some beans because there are a few risks attached. It can burn crops in some cases and will lower soil pH. Sulfur should never be used on crops that are also receiving oil sprays like neem oil. When you use a spray, you have to make sure that you get complete coverage of the plant, including the nooks and crannies underneath the leaves and low down on the stems. And generally, fungicides should be used weekly. These products are also available in both ready-to-use and concentrate formats, so you can decide which you prefer. I'm going to be starting you with a Serenade concentrate for this year, and you can decide from then on which you prefer. Fungicides can't cure plant diseases. They just keep them from spreading. So while you should definitely use them to control infections, don't expect them to cure your plants. The disease should be slowed down significantly, but infected leaves won't become uninfected. The best thing that you can do is use them as preventatives to keep them from spreading in the first place. Also, root diseases can't really be sprayed, so they're much harder to control. Luckily, they're also less common, so you'll have to focus on prevention and cleanliness for those. So now I'll go through the most common vegetable diseases. You'll notice that most of the common garden diseases are fungal, which is good news because fungi are the most easily treated compared to bacteria and viruses. You'll also notice that the vast majority of these diseases are found on tomato plants. I can pretty much guarantee that you will need to spray your tomato plants weekly all season long, but for the rest of the crops, it will depend on your garden. Tomato disease identification can often be difficult because it's not unlikely that you will have multiple diseases on the same plant, but chances are you're dealing with fungus and you should assume that it's relatively serious. You can also reach out to the county extension for a confirmed diagnosis. Powdery mildew looks like a light gray, dusty coating on plant leaves, and it's especially common in squash-type plants. It starts out as a gray film or white spots on leaves, and as it advances, it can coat the entire leaf and eventually cause them to curl and die. The best conditions for powdery mildew are hot, humid weather with little to no rain. It can occur in wet weather as well, but you should particularly watch out for it in late summer when the weather dries out a bit. Mildew can occur on just about every type of vegetable, but luckily there are different types of powdery mildew, and each are specific to different plant families. So just because your squash have it, that doesn't mean that your tomatoes will get it. Powdery mildew spreads through the air, so you can't prevent it from coming to your garden, but you can prevent it from taking hold. To keep conditions unfavorable for powdery mildew, make sure that plants are not crowded and they have enough space for air circulation. You can thin the plants out if it's really necessary, and make a note to try planting farther apart next year if you do have issues with mildew. And it is fine to remove a few leaves from the plants if they are preventing air circulation deep in the middle of the plant, and any weeds, particularly near the ground, to let the soil dry out. In general, watering the leaves of your plants is a bad idea because most diseases transmit through water. But powdery mildew survives the best when it's dry. So if we're in a long dry spell like we had last summer, it doesn't hurt to spray down the leaves once a week or so to dislodge any potential mildew spores. Just make sure you do this in the morning so they can dry back out again and you don't do it too often. You can use Serenade as a preventative spray for powdery mildew or compost tea, but the most effective spray for powdery mildew is actually milk. Just mix 1 part milk with 2 parts water and spray it on your plants on a bright, sunny day. You can repeat this weekly and it should be able to significantly slow down powdery mildew. Some people recommend baking soda, vinegar, neem oil, and many other things, but try preventing it with Serenade or milk, and if you get a bad case of it, switch to potassium bicarbonate, which is the standard commercial treatment for powdery mildew. There are also a number of mildew-resistant plant varieties, particularly squash, that you can consider growing. Downy mildew can sometimes look similar to the white spots of powdery mildew, but downy mildew thrives in cool, wet weather, so you're more likely to see it in the spring or the fall. To make it even more confusing, plants can actually have downy and powdery mildew at the same time. You can tell the spots apart by their shape. Powdery mildew spots tend to be more circular, while downy mildew gets fenced in by the plant veins, so they tend to have a more angled shape. Powdery mildew looks more like a dust sitting on top of the leaf or under the leaf, while downy mildew is more in the leaf. And there might be a significant amount of fuzz on the underside of the leaves after rain. Sometimes in downy mildew, the leaves can turn yellow before you can even see the fungus, which is frustrating. While with powdery mildew, the leaves will look relatively healthy until after the spots have been there for a while. Overall, it can be prevented the same way with air circulation and preventative fungicides like Serenade, but unfortunately downy mildew is quite a bit stronger than powdery, so if you find yourself with an infection and it's not being slowed down by other methods, you may need to bring out the copper to control it. Botrytis blight is a fungus that is also called gray mold, and it's basically just a thick, fuzzy gray mold. You can find it on any of your vegetables. It mainly affects old, weak plant parts like a spent blossom that's about to fall off or a dead or dying leaf, but it becomes a problem when it affects healthy parts of the plants. It can sometimes kill blossoms before they have a chance to be pollinated or move from the blossom onto the new fruit. On leaves, it's not always distinctive as gray mold, just a brown patch, so look out for mold on other parts of the plant to identify it. On fruits, it can invade when there's other damage like cracking or sunburn, and it can turn into a wrinkly brown spot and then cover over with mold. However, it can also show up as what's called a ghost spot, where there are faint little spots on the fruit with white rings around them. Botrytis does not grow well in windy conditions, so make sure that your plants have plenty of good airflow. Prune some of the leaves out of your tomatoes if you're having issues with botrytis, and you should be able to keep it under control with Serenade. Alternaria is a type of fungus that can cause disease in several different plant families. In tomatoes and potatoes, Alternaria is usually called early blight. In onions, it's called purple blotch. And in the Brassica family, it's called Alternaria leaf spot. You might also see Alternaria on squash, beans, and other crops, but this one is relatively easy to identify. It causes brown patches on leaves, and if you look closely, they have a distinct pattern of concentric squiggles, like a topo map of a mountain, if you know what I'm talking about. Basically, it looks like a squiggly bullseye. The spots may get crispy and dry in the middle and eventually fall out. Early blight is most likely to affect tomatoes and potatoes, and like the name, it often starts relatively early in the season, and the leaves get those distinct brown patches. Early blight on tomato fruits can appear as one big splotch or multiple splotchy patches, and sometimes you may be able to see the target shape in them. If left untreated, early blight can gradually spread through the plant and kill the whole thing. Purple blotch in onions usually presents as long ovals of damage that can turn darker in color as they progress, and you may be able to see that distinctive Alternaria target shape. It can also cause the leaves to turn brown and die at the tips. Alternaria leaf spot can occur on tomatoes and other crops, but you'll mainly see it on brassicas like cabbage. The spots will start out small, but some of them can get pretty large, and the dry tissue in the middle may crack. Serenade can work as a preventative against Alternaria, and a weekly spray of copper can slow it down in the early stages of infection. Phytophthora causes late blight in potatoes and tomatoes. You can probably guess this tends to appear towards the end of the season, and it looks like weak water-soaked spots on the leaves that sort of look like they were bruised, and then they'll develop a grayish mold. It looks like a bruise on the fruit as well, usually starting as a brownish spot under the skin before affecting the surface. Late blight can be very severe. This is what caused the Irish potato famine. This one will almost always come from infected seeds or plants, so make sure that you know where your plants are coming from. Get certified seed if you can. Don't grow potatoes saved by a friend in case they have a small amount of late blight on them. That said, it also can transmit miles by wind from garden to garden pretty quickly and infect an entire area in a particular year. Fungicide sprays can help with late blight, but the best control is blight-resistant plant varieties. Fusarium is another common tomato fungus that you're more likely to see later in the season, but it can happen anytime. The first sign is yellowing leaves and wilt in hot weather, and it might first appear in only one part of the plant, like only on one side. It can even show up on one side of a leaf, but not the other. The top of the plant will keep growing, but eventually the disease will catch up with it and it can kill the whole plant. Unfortunately, there's no treatment for Fusarium wilt. Fusarium is soil-borne, so mulching is important to prevent its spread. It can survive in the soil for years, so if you have a Fusarium infestation, you may need to solarize your soil, which is when you cover it with plastic during the summer to cook it for around 6 weeks. Verticillium wilt is very similar to Fusarium wilt. It's yellowing and wilting that can also affect one side or one part of the plant, but it progresses a little bit more slowly than Fusarium, moving from one leaf to the next. The leaves can develop yellow and then brown blotches and then entirely wilt and die. Like Fusarium, Verticillium can be persistent in the soil for years. Growing resistant varieties is by far the best way to control Fusarium and Verticillium wilts. Anthracnose is a fungus that can cause soft rotting spots on a variety of crops. The spots are sunken in like a dent, and often they have a pinkish tan color to them in the center, but they can also grow a white or black mold. On leaves, it can cause brown spots that may also have a pinkish fuzzy spot in wet weather. Remove infected fruits and leaves as quickly as possible and dispose of them in the trash, not the compost. The best way to prevent anthracnose is with Serenade, and copper can be used as a treatment if necessary. Southern blight can occur on tomatoes and occasionally other crops during very hot weather. The telltale sign of southern blight is when the very base of the plant, just above the soil line, rots away and the plant falls over. There's really nothing that can be done about southern blight, so be sure to follow all of the best practices for disease prevention. Septoria leaf spot can look similar to bacterial spot on tomatoes, which I will get to in a moment. This fungal disease causes small brown freckly spots to develop on the leaves, and the fruit may not be affected. The spots are round and usually don't grow as large as leaf spots from other tomato disease, but there may be quite a few of them. The spots may start on the tip of the leaf and work their way backwards and turn the leaf yellow as it goes. Rust is a disease caused by fungus, and the effects look just like rust on metal. Your plants will have reddish-orange spots on them, and while this is generally not deadly to plants, it will definitely weaken them. You're most likely to see rust in beans, onions, and sometimes corn. There's also a disease called white rust that appears on spinach, which looks similar, but the spots will be a lighter color like pink or white. Serenade can work as a preventative, and copper or sulfur fungicides can help with an infection. Keep leaves dry when possible and make sure that you have plenty of air circulation. Clubroot presents in brassica plants like cabbage and broccoli as stunted growth. The plants are wilting, small, and the leaves might have yellowing or pest issues. This is because the roots are being infected by a soil fungus, and when you pull the plant up, you'll see a thick, knobbly base underground. Make sure that you check all of your brassica roots for this when you pull up the plants. Unfortunately, clubroot can't be treated with fungicides, and once it's in your soil, it can last for 10 years or more. So be sure to practice careful crop rotation and choose clubroot-resistant varieties if you need to. In a bad case, you may also have to solarize your soil for clubroot. Bacterial wilt is transmitted through cucumber beetles, mainly to squash family plants, but it can affect tomatoes as well. The leaves will wilt during the day, sometimes starting with just a few, and they'll recover during the night, but this is more wilting than can be explained by heat. Bacterial wilt can also sometimes cause the leaf margins, the edges, to turn yellow and then brown and crispy. Unfortunately, there's no treatment for bacterial wilt, but it can be prevented with Serenade and by controlling cucumber beetle populations, like by using row cover fabric. Some squash varieties are also less attractive to cucumber beetles, which can help. Bacterial spot usually shows up on peppers and tomatoes. Yellow dots will appear on the leaves, which will turn a darker brown, and then the whole leaf may fall off. On peppers, the fruits might get little freckles, but on tomatoes, they're usually larger. Usually, bacterial spot will come from infected seeds or transplants, and then it spreads through water, so rainy weather will make it worse. Serenade and copper fungicide can be effective. Mosaic viruses are a family of diseases that affect different crops. Tobacco mosaic virus and cucumber mosaic virus are the most common in vegetable gardens. Despite the names, they're not very crop specific and they can infect multiple crop families. It will show up as light colored and then yellow patches on leaves, more like streaks than spots, and the leaves might become bumpy or wrinkled. It can also sometimes cause the veins, just the veins, to turn yellow, and it can be hard to tell this apart from a nutritional deficiency. Viruses on fruits are more distinct. They have a very colorful, sort of tie-dye appearance. Mosaic viruses are most often transmitted through insects like cucumber beetles and aphids. Tobacco mosaic virus can also be found in cigarettes and other tobacco products, so if you're a smoker, do not smoke near the garden and make sure you wash your hands very well every time you go into your garden. Unfortunately, there's no treatment for viral diseases, so follow precautions to avoid bringing it into the garden and plant resistant varieties when possible. All right, now let's just go over a few other things that you might see happen. Low germination, there are a lot of possibilities here, so to figure out the cause, you may have to use the process of elimination. Make sure that you plant the seeds at the right depth because too deep and they'll die before they make it to the surface, and too shallow they could die of exposure. It's possible that they dried out if the soil didn't stay moist, or they rotted if the soil was really waterlogged. It could also be that your seeds or sprouts were discovered by a critter, like a bird or cutworm. It's also possible that the seeds have a decreased germination rate, like if they were old or if the packet was potentially exposed to heat or moisture. If you don't have very smooth soil, like if it's clumpy or rocky, you might try to focus on having a smooth seed bed, maybe planting into a layer of soft compost on top of the soil. And it could also be that they're just taking their sweet time and they will come up eventually. It can take up to 2 weeks for some seeds. In all of these cases, you can try digging around in their soil for the seeds to see if you can figure out what happened, and then just planting again. Yellowing leaves is an extremely common plant symptom, and that's because it's just a general sign of stress. There is no specific cause for yellowing leaves, so it could be just about anything. Very often it can be from water, too much water or too little drainage, but it can also be caused by not enough water, nutrient deficiency, or fertilizer burn, or pests, or disease, weather stress. Sometimes it's just aging of old leaves and it's normal. So when you notice yellowing leaves, you'll have to figure out more information to find the cause. Like, did you recently fertilize? Has there been a lot of rain? Are the leaves turning yellow all over or in patches? If just the bottom leaves are turning yellow and falling off, it's probably relatively normal, especially for fruiting plants like peppers and okra. It can be a sign of low nitrogen, but there's no need to fertilize because the plant should be focusing on the fruit instead of the leaves anyway. If the bottom leaves are falling off faster than they're growing, you might try some compost as a very gentle source of nitrogen. If the entire plant is turning slightly pale, it's probably one of those general stressors like weather. If the plant is turning yellow unevenly, like if the leaves have yellow spots or yellow edges, it's more likely to be a more serious problem like a disease or a nutrient deficiency. So vegetables actually can get too much light and get sunburned. On leaves, this might happen right after you transplant, especially if they weren't fully hardened off. It might also happen during especially hot, sunny weather or from using a foliar spray like neem oil. A sunburn on leaves will usually look like a very pale yellow, almost white. Occasionally, you can also get brown spots on the leaves. There's no need to remove sunburned leaves from a plant, and getting rid of them will just stress the plant out more. You can also get sunburn on fruits, especially tomatoes and peppers, but you might also see it on cucumbers and melons. Sunburn will start out as a slightly pale spot, pale green, and as time passes, it will get paler and start to turn a very light brown, tan color. The spot will get wrinkly, and eventually it will thin out until there's just a membrane left. This is something you should keep in mind while pruning and trellising your tomato plants because you want the fruits to be open to the sunlight, but if they're completely exposed, they could get sunburned. You can still eat vegetables with sunburn, but I recommend that you cover or harvest as soon as you notice the pale spot to prevent it from progressing and potentially starting to rot. If your plants are having recurring issues with sunburn, you'll want to figure out a way to give them some shade. Surround, that kaolin clay, cools plants down significantly and blocks excessive sunlight. You can also put a shade cloth up over your garden, which may or may not be practical depending on how much area you want to cover. If you just have a couple plants that you want to shade, you could definitely just put up a beach umbrella. Row cover fabric is not usually practical for preventing sunburn because it will create more heat than shade. If all you want is to protect specific fruits, you can put a lightweight cover over them individually, something like a cheesecloth that won't create extra heat. Just make sure that you don't cover up your plants too much because sunlight and heat is the key to sweetness in the ripening process, so it should be a balance. Usually the main sign of fertilizer burn is yellowing on the tips of the leaves. Then you might see dry and crispy brown patches. Sometimes leaves will fall off of the plant, especially at the bottom. But sometimes it can be more subtle signs like slight wilting or increased insect damage. So if you're using any type of fertilizer, watch your plants closely for a couple of weeks afterwards. Follow the instructions on any commercial fertilizers and use lower doses on younger plants. Plants should not be fertilized at all until they've been in the garden for a few weeks and given a chance to establish themselves. Granular fertilizer should never be used on young seedlings or it could kill them. After you've applied too much fertilizer, you can't take it back out, so be very careful with fertilizer. So flowering plants have both male and female parts that need to come together to make the fruit, but the way that works varies from crop to crop. Pollination is only necessary for crops that are fruit, the ones with seeds. Okra and the squash family, so zucchini, pumpkins, winter squash, cucumbers, and melons, must be pollinated by insects because they have separate male and female flowers. If they don't get completely pollinated, they'll end up misshapen. Sometimes one end is much wider than the other, or only one side gets pollinated and the whole thing curls. These are still totally fine to eat. Beans, peas, peppers, and tomatoes are generally self-pollinating, so each flower has both a male and female part, and wind is usually enough to mix them together, but insect pollination definitely helps. These generally don't have too many issues with pollination, but pollen can be affected by other factors like temperature. If the temperature gets too far outside of the 65 to 85 degree range, you might get less fruit set or even no fruit set on peppers and tomatoes. Since these plants produce flowers continuously, there'll be a gap after the extreme weather, but then they should go back to normal. Corn requires a pretty significant amount of wind for pollination, so you might want to give your plants a good shake while they're flowering. And planting corn in blocks rather than rows is the best way to make sure that they get good pollination. Poor pollination for corn will result in having missing kernels that never filled out. And remember that corn is the one crop that can hybridize in the first year, so don't plant two varieties at the same time. They'll turn out funky if they get cross-pollinated, so if you want to grow different types of corn, make sure that they're planted several weeks apart so they aren't being pollinated at the same time. Other pollination issues can be caused by issues with flowers, like botrytis rot on the petals. If you don't have flowers, you can't get fruit. Misshapen fruits, this is another one that can have a wide range of causes, like pollination, which I talked about. Incomplete pollination is common in squash. The squash might be thicker on one end than the other if it didn't get fully pollinated. It can also just be from the fruit being blocked from growing properly, like if there's a stem in the way. This is pretty common, especially in peppers. Root crops will also get misshapen if they run into obstacles in the ground as they grow, like rocks. In other cases, it can be from an aphid or stink bug that decided to take a sip, causing the plant to curve at that point. Sometimes it's caused by a scar, like if the fruit got nicked while growing and then got misshapen around that point. It can also be caused by environmental conditions like inconsistent moisture or cold. In all of these cases, it's no big deal. They're still perfectly fine to eat. Misshapen fruits on tomatoes is called cat facing. Typically, this will show up on the bottom of the fruit. Cat facing is caused by some type of damage to the blossom, like from cold temperature or insect bites. Some varieties are more likely to get it than others, particularly really large heirloom varieties may get it. There's really nothing wrong with the tomato other than the fact that it's a little harder to cut. You can remove cat-faced tomatoes from the plant if you really want to, because if you catch it when it's really small, the plant can use its energy to try again instead of ripening that one. There's not much that can be done to prevent cat facing, so if it really bothers you, you can consider growing smaller tomato varieties. Now let's talk about some other things that specifically affect tomatoes because they always get their own category. Blossom end rot. This is a pretty common tomato issue that will look like a disease, but luckily it isn't. Blossom end rot is a spot on the bottom of the tomato that will start by looking kind of bruised and then brown, and the longer it goes, it can dry out and get sunken, and the longer it's left, eventually it can get moldy and rot. It specifically happens on the bottom of the fruit, which is the part where the blossom used to be, hence blossom end rot. This is caused by a lack of calcium in the tomato fruit. However, this does not necessarily mean that you don't have enough calcium in your soil. A lack of calcium in the fruit could mean that you don't have enough calcium in your soil, or it could also mean that the plant just isn't able to take up the calcium and put it in the fruit, which is usually more likely. This can be caused by a low soil pH, like we talked about how pH can block certain nutrients. So if your soil pH is below 6.5 or so, your plants may not be able to access the calcium in the soil. So if your tomatoes are consistently getting blossom end rot, you might want to add some calcium to your soil. If your pH is good, you can add gypsum. But if you want to increase your pH and add calcium, you can put in some lime. The best way to prevent this is to properly amend your soil at the beginning of the season with gypsum or lime, and a source of phosphorus can also help. But if you're suddenly finding tomatoes with blossom end rot after getting plenty of good ones, the most likely cause is actually inconsistent moisture, too wet or too dry. A sudden change in the amount of water that the plants are receiving can disrupt calcium absorption. So in this case, adding calcium won't really help at all. If you know that there's been a change in weather or a change in your watering pattern recently, you can probably just wait it out and see if they go back to normal. To prevent this, try to keep their water levels consistent all year. This doesn't mean keeping them moist all year because too much water isn't good for tomatoes. But pay attention to the weather and adjust your watering accordingly to keep them from going through any drastic changes. You want everything to be gradual. And this is another reason why it's important to mulch your tomato plants because that helps keep the soil moisture steady. The last possibility for blossom end rot is fertilizing the tomatoes mid-season. If they get a sudden delivery, particularly of nitrogen, they won't be able to take up enough calcium to balance it. So go easy on the fertilizer and avoid nitrogen altogether on tomatoes when they're fruiting. When you have blossom end rot on a tomato, it can't be reversed. So again, like sunburn, pick the tomato as soon as you notice it. It's better to make some fried green tomatoes than to open the tomato up to the possibility of mold. Also, blossom end rot is definitely the most common in tomatoes, but it can happen in other vegetables like peppers, squash, and melons. So if you find something that looks like blossom end rot in another crop, it's certainly not out of the question that that's what it is. Cracks and splits are another common water issue for tomatoes. When they get too much water too fast, the skin can split right open down the length of the tomato, across the side, or in rings around the stem. This could potentially also happen if they got a huge intake of fertilizer. This isn't an issue if you catch it right away, but if it goes unnoticed, it's another chance for a mold to get into your tomatoes. Sometimes they'll heal over on their own and be fine, but depending on the conditions, it could get pretty gnarly. Green shoulders or yellow shoulders is when the top part of your tomato never turns fully colored. This can be normal depending on the tomato variety, so make sure you know what to expect. Like Cherokee Purple, which some of you are growing this year, tends to keep some level of green on the top. You can tell if it's abnormal if it's noticeably harder than the rest of the tomato. When this is the case, it's never going to finish coloring up, so go ahead and harvest when the bottom part of the tomato is ready. Yellow or green shoulders are usually caused by too much heat, so you can treat it the same way that you would treat sunburn with kaolin clay, shade cloth, or cheesecloth. pruning the leaves a little less, and so on. If this doesn't help, it's also potentially caused by low potassium. And like blossom end rot, it could be in the soil but blocked, so you may or may not need to add potassium. Leaf curl. When tomato leaves curl upward like this, it's a sign of stress, usually from weather. Sometimes because it's too dry, oftentimes it's just too hot. Occasionally, it can be caused by the other extreme, cold, wet weather. Once the leaves roll up, they'll probably never unroll, but they'll still be fine. Just make sure that you keep an eye on plants with curled leaves because remember, stress can open the plant up to pests and disease. Nutrient deficiencies and toxicities, lack and excess, can get very complicated. A lot of nutrient issues are sort of nonspecific, like yellowing leaves or poor growth. And a deficiency of one nutrient can look the same as an excess of another nutrient, and that may actually be the case because remember, too much of one nutrient can sometimes block another. Plus, you may have issues with multiple nutrients at the same time. So, it's not easy to give a simple guide to nutrient problems. You should definitely suspect nutrient issues if you notice your plant's struggling without a clear cause. And the first thing I would do if I suspect a nutrient issue is spray some compost tea for a quick boost of general fertility and test soil pH. This is pretty easy. There are test kits available at the store, and knowing your pH can definitely help narrow down the list of possibilities. Because if your pH is off, you can pretty much guarantee that it's a nutrient problem, and certain deficiencies are more likely with high pH and others with low pH. You should also consult your soil test and think about what amendments you've made to your soil recently to figure out which of the nutrients might be the most likely. If you aren't sure which nutrient or nutrients are causing the problem, it's usually best to avoid guessing the nutrient and adding a specific nutrient amendment to the soil, because if you guess incorrectly, it could backfire. It's best to ask the county extension, and if they can't identify it, they can actually send a tissue sample of your plant to the lab to find out for sure. But you don't always need to figure out the exact issue. Start by adding broad spectrum fertility like compost and compost tea if your plants are showing general signs of poor growth. In some cases, nutrient issues are caused by short-term problems, like how blossom end rot can be caused by water changes. So it may be an overreaction to dump a bunch of amendments into the soil. Just keep an eye on your plants and notice the progression of symptoms. Even if your plant's leaves are just turning yellow, the pattern of yellowing can give you very important clues. Whether the whole leaf is turning yellow or just in certain parts can signal certain nutrients. And whether the issue is affecting the oldest leaves or the newest leaves is a big clue as well and can narrow down the options. Some nutrients hardly affect the leaves at all and focus on the growing tips, fruits, or roots. So if it's looking bad down on the bottom of the plant, it's most likely to be potassium, magnesium, or molybdenum. If the newer leaves are affected, it's more likely to be iron, manganese, or zinc. If it's the growing tips, it's probably calcium or boron. And if it's an all-over issue or not obviously affecting one part, it could be nitrogen, copper, sulfur, or phosphorus. Usually the first possibilities for nutrient issues are the macronutrients, N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Low nitrogen is possible if you're seeing generally poor growth and you haven't added anything to the soil for a while. Sometimes the leaves are yellow further down, but sometimes it's just a general yellowing. If you add nitrogen, remember to do so sparingly because it's easy to overdo it. Phosphorus deficiency has the very telltale sign of leaves turning a purplish or reddish color, especially in tomatoes and brassicas. However, this is often a sign that the plant just isn't able to take up phosphorus in the soil, usually if the soil is really cold or waterlogged. And phosphorus deficiency in the soil, like long term, can be more sneaky, like if you're not getting as much fruit as you would expect or if they aren't tasting that good. Phosphorus is most effective when it's added at the beginning of the season. Potassium deficiencies are usually relatively noticeable. The leaves might get dry brown patches, leaf margins might look burned, and they might curl downwards. The older leaves tend to be affected first, but you might also see general stunted growth. You may also see fruits dropping off of the plant before they're fully ripe for potassium. Next, you have the secondary nutrients, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. Calcium deficiency, of course, can cause blossom end rot on fruits as well as just stopping new growth. In an extreme case, growing tips can sometimes just turn brown and die from lack of calcium. You can notice a magnesium deficiency by its pattern of yellowing. The leaves will turn yellow, but the veins will stay bright green. And old leaves can turn very pale and just fall off. Sulfur deficiency is usually not too likely, but it can look like yellowing and upward curling of the leaves and poor growth, stunted growth, kind of similar to nitrogen deficiency. Other nutrients. Unfortunately, iron deficiency can look similar to magnesium, where the leaves are yellow but the veins stay green. But iron affects the new leaves while magnesium affects the old. Iron deficiency is more likely in soils with high pH. Manganese deficiency can also show new leaves turning yellow with the veins staying green, but while in iron deficiency, eventually the entire leaf will turn yellow. In manganese, the veins will never turn yellow. The leaves can also turn very pale and sometimes curl, and plant growth may be stunted. Zinc can also cause stunted growth and a sort of mottled yellowing in the leaves. The leaves might also be unusually small or narrow, and sometimes new growth can die. Molybdenum can also cause a mottled yellowing, but old leaves are affected first. Molybdenum deficiency can also cause the leaves to be curled up and never open all the way up. Copper deficiency can cause crinkled, rolled up leaves, particularly in new growth. The leaves might be pale and plant growth may slow way down. One downside of having very high organic matter in your soil is that you could be more prone to copper deficiency. A lack of boron can cause deformed growth at the new growing tips of the plant. Remember to only add boron if you know that it's deficient, because it can easily become toxic in the soil. Actually, a number of these can really mess up your soil when you add them specifically when you don't need to. So it's best to stick with very general fertility like compost and consult with the extension if you think you need to add something specific like boron. Okay, I know that was a lot, and I don't expect you to memorize all of this stuff. I just want to put it on your radar, what bugs and diseases and everything to be looking out for. You can come back to this information anytime. There's also a lot of great information online for dealing with these issues in more depth, particularly if you go to any university extension website. Of course, I can help you figure out what to do about these issues in your garden, and particularly for more complicated issues like nutrient deficiencies, the Smith County Cooperative Extension is the best resource for solving problems. Remember, that's Andy Overbay. There's his email, phone number, and address, and that's in Marion. Overall, just try not to stress about problems in the garden. They will happen. It's all just part of the process. So plant a little extra and learn for next time. So thank you again to Homegrown's funding organization, Americans Helping Americans. And as always, please let me know if you have any questions about anything in this video. Next time, we'll actually already be starting to plan your fall gardens, which sounds like crazy, but it will be time. So thank you for watching all the way through this very long video.